Good evening and welcome to Fireside Chat with Linda LaRouche by the LaRouche Organization for Thursday, July 15th. We are going to go directly to our topic, which has been generally called the Forgotten Roots of the United Nations. We have an interesting circumstance. Well, there are many things that are going on, and rather than try to spend much time, everybody is aware that the post-Putin-Biden world is significantly different than the world was before that meeting occurred. There are continuing attempts to foment division and even warfare between Russia and China, and there is a bellicose and very foolish attempt to demonize China. Any of these things, despite the fact of what people's fantasies about the world are, could lead to immediate thermonuclear confrontation. But get a better idea of the character of what has caused these in part this circumstance to get out of control, the delusions to get out of control. Let's just note that tonight the baseball game between the Yankees and the Red Sox was canceled because of a COVID outbreak among the Yankees. There are 3 players who've tested positive. There are 6 more likely positives, including, Aaron Judge, one of the major players. All or most have been vaccinated. There were no symptoms for most of them, but they are infectious. And the report is that they have the Delta variant. And therefore there is quite a freak out about what the implications of this are. But let me also point out that we know that 95% plus of the cases of coronavirus that have been admitting to the hospital have been among people who are unvaccinated. But then again, we also have another new pattern of either death or infection among young people, like the young man in Georgia who was 24 years old, who'd been refusing to get the vaccine, and then contracted COVID and needed a double lung transplant. And as they say, his famous last words were, "I should have gotten the vaccine." Not the last words, but after the operation. That's simply said, not to talk about coronavirus, but the problem of delusion. It's important to recognize that once upon a time, there were great American presidents. And those great American presidents made a difference. They made a difference not only to the United States, but they made a difference to the entire world. We want to talk tonight about the intent of the last great period of the American presidency, which was between 1933, March 4th of 1933, and April 14th, I believe it was, of 1945, with the death of Franklin Roosevelt. And Gerry Rose has been doing work on this. And so in order for him to just have the time he needs and get everybody involved, we're going to go right to him. And then in the course of the question and answer period and so forth, we'll give you information on various things. I'll just indicate that on July 24th, Saturday, the Schiller Institute will be holding an international conference. And the basic title is, "There is no climate emergency. Apply the science and economics of development to stop blackouts and death. There is no climate emergency." As you can see, we are making sure that our approach to winning friends and influencing people is to tell the truth, no matter who would not like to hear it. And that's exactly what I believe the next presentation is going to do. And so we'll go right to Gerry Rose, and then from him into questions, answers, and discussion. So, Gerry?
Yeah, sure. Can people hear me? I just want to, we've been having trouble with some volume. Can you hear me?
Clear. You're very clear.
Okay, great. Okay. There are very few books of such an extraordinary characteristic that really should reestablish a completely different understanding of who Franklin Roosevelt was, who Marshal Stalin was, and their extraordinary relationship, which at the Yalta Conference established the United Nations. There is no other way to understand what happened between Franklin Roosevelt and Stalin, which is stunning beyond belief. Everything you have read about this relationship has been a lie. The whole Cold War, and you will be stunned tonight, I assure you. The whole Cold War was the attempt to destroy the relationship between Franklin Roosevelt and Stalin, and that it was a direct contradiction of everything that Franklin Roosevelt and the UN effort at Yalta was aimed at. The fact is that the Yalta Conference, where it was lied about, and every historian that you have been taught lied about what actually happened at the Yalta Conference, and actually lied that Roosevelt was too sick. He capitulated to Stalin, and he gave away Eastern Europe. That, everything about that was a lie. And the book called Roosevelt and Stalin, one of the more important included aspects of the book, although that's by no means the single focus of it, is the whole Cold War was an attack not on Stalin, and I've said this before, but now we have the proof, on Franklin Roosevelt and his team, in a way that to me was stunning. I had gotten pieces of it in terms of what happened to, of course, the great Vice President Henry Wallace, what had happened to Harry Dexter White, who crushed the British at the Bretton Woods Conference, which we've discussed before. I had gotten pieces of it, and from the beginning, given the centrality of what Franklin Roosevelt had created over the 12 years, or 4,000 days would be a better way to think about it, in which neither Wall Street nor London had anything to say to Franklin Roosevelt about what had to be done. Nothing. I'm not going to go through it again, but that this moment in history, these 12 years, totally transformed the world and took the United States, which had been looted and destroyed over the period of 1921 to 1933, uh, the character and genius, and I hope to write a much longer essay, much longer, on this question of make America good again. Because it's the dialogue between Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon LaRouche and Jack Kennedy and others, but really this primary insights, both established as policy by Franklin Roosevelt and a greater, more in-depth insight presented by Lyndon LaRouche, defined the potential for the greatest revolution in world history, which I'm not going to go through tonight. I've indicated it in several things, but I intend to. But what I'm going to go through tonight, and it's based upon this unbelievably researched book. It had to be really well done. This is a book, Roosevelt and Stalin, Portrait of a Partnership by Susan Butler. She knew she had to do her work because, she was asked in an interview, well, what about this book when you were writing it? Were there any aha moments? And what she replied in this interview was, the whole book was a revelation to me. The whole thing was an aha moment. There was no pragmatic relationship between Franklin Roosevelt and Marshall Stalin. That the cumulative effect, and she said she started her work, there were 300, the complete correspondence. Her first work is My Dear Mr. Stalin, which was 300 letters between Franklin Roosevelt and Joseph P. Stalin. And she realized, because this had never been done before, she realized what occurred between these two men at the bequest of Franklin Roosevelt was an actual partnership which was supposed to have ended the colonial world. And that was the actual discussion at Yalta, which she documents brilliantly. And there is, as I said, a punchline at the end of this, which will knock your socks off, on how the Cold War was started against everything Franklin Roosevelt fought for. So, now to the story. Roosevelt had known, as of 1941, that the bulwark of the defeat of the Nazi war machine would have to come from Russia. He understood that very clearly during the Lend-Lease policy of 1941. And in fact, Roosevelt sought Stalin out and sent Ambassador Harriman, and that's a double-edged sword, as we'll talk about later, sent Ambassador Harriman, Averell Harriman, of Brown Brothers Harriman, of other fame that we've discussed before, as his personal envoy to Churchill and Stalin. During the Barbarossa attack, where the Nazis poured into Russia and were making enormous strides in the initial part of the war until they reached Stalingrad. Roosevelt sent Harriman to meet with Stalin. What occurred in a series of back and forth within days, and this was all through cable traffic through the war room in the United States, is that Roosevelt told Harriman, get a list of everything that Stalin needed to fight the war. Roosevelt had no approval from the Senate at all. Most of the Senate would have gone ape knowing what Roosevelt was up to. And in the course of the cables back and forth, Stalin was extremely knowledgeable about exactly what kind of equipment he would need, where he would need it, how to produce it, the inputs. He knew everything about the war, his generals. He was extraordinary in terms of his grasp of what was going on. So Roosevelt proposed to Stalin that his request was too modest, and said, we will triple the number of tanks you have asked for. And Roosevelt went through the list. He said, this is what we're going to send. And he said, Roosevelt said to Stalin, you now have $1 billion credit line. And frankly, you ultimately don't have to pay it back. As the Nazi forces were moving in on Stalingrad, this cable received by Stalin, by Roosevelt. Stalin, in this book, it documents it. What she did was she took, she's an extraordinary researcher. She researched this book over a 5-year period from everybody's notes, everybody's memoirs. Because what she concludes is stunning. So she knew she had to have it where no one could refute what she was up to, right? So Stalin, receiving this note from Roosevelt, said to Harriman, we can now win the war. When the first attacks of the Nazis came across the border, he couldn't believe it. He was forced into this Hitler-Stalin pact because, frankly, as Lynn said, as we know, it was clear to everybody, Britain and France would never work with Russia to crush the Nazis. They wanted the Nazis to kill the communists, and they ruled the world. And France was a real piece of filth on this one. Okay, a real piece of filth, as they later proved in 6 weeks when they lost all of France to the Nazis. And so Stalin says we can now win the war. And with Zhukov and the unbelievable courage, pure gut courage, with the knowledge that the Nazis hated Slavic people, the Nazis killed 27 million Russians the Nazis killed 3 million Russian prisoners of war. So when you start surrounding Russia, you better think twice. They swear, and they're right. They will never be surrounded again. The price they paid was unimaginable. And anyone who doesn't understand that understands nothing. Right? And the idea that Stalin was as bad as Hitler is the biggest load of garbage you have ever heard in your life. Right? Because we're gonna actually discover what this issue really was. Now, at 1941, as Roosevelt is supplying the goods for the war, the food, so that Russia can fight the war, and he says to Harriman, "You must have Stalin relent on the question of religious freedom." Can you imagine that? Can you imagine any president who, in the midst of a life and death struggle, as he knew in 1941 when he proposed the Four Freedoms, he says to Stalin, and he wasn't saying quid pro quo, give the religious freedom and you'll get the equipment. He didn't say that. He would never do that. And he insisted that there be religious freedom in Russia. And by 1943, Stalin granted religious freedom before the first meeting with Roosevelt at Tehran. The other thing, which it will completely shock you, is in 1943, before Stalin met for the first time with Roosevelt, he dissolved the Communist International. This is stunning. He said communist parties should be part of their nations. They should fight for their ideas and their commitments. But we don't want to overthrow governments. We want to be part of governments, which is fascinating. And why did he do that? And this is a remarkable insight that this Susan Butler had. Remarkable, really. She said, look, Stalin saw himself as Ivan the Terrible. And he had Eisenstein, the famous movie director, movie producer, whatever, do a very famous, grandiose version of Ivan the Terrible. Now, this would force you, if you're an honest person, to think. You know, nations come into existence in many ways. Of course, you have the geniuses of Louis XI and Joan of Arc that created the first nation state in France. And then you had the Henry VII, which I've looked into. This was not a very subtle affair. the Lancasters, the Lancastrian, and the the War of the Roses went on and lasted for close to the factions lasted for close to 100 years. So when Henry VII came into power, he crushed both houses, the Lancastrian houses and the York houses. He crushed them both. He taxed them out of existence. He ruthlessly pursued anybody who would not toe the line that he was the king, that his heirs would rule, and he consolidated through extremely ruthless methods. Not quite what Stalin had to do, but extremely ruthless. There's a book called The Winter King. Will give you a sense of that. But because he consolidated rule and made England one country with a commitment to no more wars on the continent of Europe, which England did nothing but make wars on the continent of Europe, there was a flowering of the intellectuals like Collett, Lineker. They went to study directly Plato. They went to Italy. Extraordinary, which later really flowers in Shakespeare. But without that consolidation, if you have not crushed your internal opposition, you have war after war after war, which is what Shakespeare writes about in the famous history plays. So Stalin saw himself as consolidating a nation. And he had a lot of opposition, enormous opposition. Would I have done it his way? I know I wouldn't have. But could you have done it any other way? I'm not sure. And in 1933, Roosevelt was the first U.S. president to recognize the Soviet Union, which freaked the works out. Because he saw the Soviets. Hitler had just come to power in 1933. And he saw the Soviets as one of the bulwarks against both Japan and Hitler's Germany. And he opened up trade, opened up credits, opened up a whole process to break Russia out of its isolation, to be part of a community of nations. Not every revolution, and it should give us some pride in the real sense of what the American Revolution really was. And what we did, the incredible depth of intellect, the incredible cultural capability of our own people. We didn't have to go through that, but we had to get rid of the British Empire. And you may say what you want, and Mao made a lot of mistakes, but he stood up to the British Empire. It could have been done better if Chiang Kai-shek and others had listened to the American and the American system of Sun Yat-sen and really fought for that. But the fact of the matter is, you had to have land reform, you had to have major changes, and therefore sometimes creating a new nation is not sometimes, except for the American Revolution. These were not very, and of course the French, these were not very pretty affairs. right? Because you always have this oligarchy out to crush any movement of people that they didn't run. So what I'm saying is somewhat stunning here, and I don't want to get into that as the primary subject, but the fact of the matter is Stalin saw himself as creating a nation that would have been the subject of oligarchical genocide under Hitler's regime. So here's Franklin Roosevelt. By 1943, as I said, he ends, Stalin ends the Comintern, and Stalin grants religious freedom. Not just to the Eastern Orthodox Church, which was a little earlier, which he made that decision at Stalingrad itself. He called on the church to work with him to defend Mother Russia. But later, in 1943, he gave religious freedom to all religions in Russia. That was reversed because of the Cold War. But when you find out why there was a Cold War, you'll understand who's to blame. Now, the first meeting that Roosevelt had with Stalin was private. This was at Tehran. Roosevelt would not meet with Churchill before Tehran, would not coordinate our efforts, and wanted an unmediated relationship with Stalin. He understood if there was going to be a post-war world, Russia would have to be part of that community of nations. And he made it plain to Stalin that he had nothing to do with Churchill, nothing in terms of his policies. So what's the first thing? The first private meeting, which he has in great detail in this book, was the first thing that Roosevelt says is to Stalin, France cannot be resurrected immediately. What they did in turning over France to the Nazis, particularly the Vichy, well, not particularly, the Vichy government, they, at the end of the war, will have to rebuild, but we will give them no colonies. Every single one of their colonies should be under trusteeship until they can elect their own governments, including and emphatically French Indochina or Vietnam. That's the first thing he says to Stalin. Stalin couldn't agree more. The second thing he says to Stalin, Roosevelt and his generals, in order to take the pressure off Stalin on the Eastern Front, had decided to start a second front in northern France, or in France. Marshall was the general in charge, totally agreed with Stalin and Roosevelt. They had to start the war in France to pin down the Nazi machine and take the pressure off the Eastern Front. And this was not rhetoric. Marshall had a brawl the British insisted it had to be North Africa. The British wanted to make sure that the Russian troops did not come from the east and us from the west and crush the Nazi machine. What the British game plan is to come up through Italy and cut the Russians off at some point in Eastern Europe and make sure they didn't take over Eastern Europe, right? Now, at one point, and then the third thing that Roosevelt said in this private meeting, which Churchill was not invited to, he said, at the end of the war, we're going to have a very large merchant fleet. And there should be a capacity to just give a significant part of that fleet to Russia. And Molotov, who was there with Stalin, said, yes, we can buy American goods, we can have trade, we can work on this, right? So, that's the private meeting. France has no colonies. The second front would be opened, and the post-war period, the Russians would get the merchant navy. So this, and through the Tehran conference, which she develops very, very effectively, Roosevelt was clear that on the second front issue, which Churchill was vociferous about, and his whole team was vociferous, we had to start in North Africa, right? Stalin kept going at Churchill at the whole time, and there was an agreement to start the second front at a certain earlier point. Now, Roosevelt, in describing this to Elliott Roosevelt, you know, people say, oh, well, you know, he just wanted to have some kind of pragmatic relationship with Stalin. And this is barbarously stupid. Franklin at one point, this author was asked, well, was Franklin Roosevelt ever afraid of Stalin? So Susan Butler said, Franklin Roosevelt was afraid of no one and nothing. That's what you have to understand about Franklin Roosevelt. He did it from a deep moral commitment to the future of mankind. And I'm saying this, she didn't quite have it in the way she should have, right? But she understood implicitly. She's an extremely insightful person. But she said he was afraid of no one and nothing. So at Tehran, Roosevelt was functioning as early as 1941. But Tehran in 1943, he'd already gotten Stalin to decommission the Communist International because Stalin wanted to work with Roosevelt. He didn't trust Churchill, who could, but he wanted to work with Roosevelt as part of a community of nations. And he granted religious freedom. And for Roosevelt was deep and abiding. Dennis Speed has pointed out many times the kind of moral character that was Franklin Roosevelt's. And I think Dennis said it correctly earlier on this week when he said, what we're going to observe tonight is the power of the presidency to shape the future. And Susan Butler put it in a fascinating way. She said, and she quotes Walt Whitman, but she's got it. I mean, she just happens to quote Walt Whitman. She says, to have a friend, you have to be a friend. And that's who Roosevelt was for every nation on this planet. He didn't just come up with everywhere in the world as some rhetorical stance. As you saw, at the height of the Barbarossa attack, he told Harriman, you must give the Russian people religious freedom. The other thing, which is stunning, just stunning, Stalin had some meetings with Churchill before he met with Roosevelt, and he said he understood Churchill, Stalin, on some level. He said, look, he said it in a toast at Tehran. No, Yalta. I'm sorry, Yalta. He said, Winston Churchill may be the bravest leader in the world. He stood alone against the Nazi machine. He said, for this we must toast him. And he meant it. So he had a meeting, Stalin had a meeting with Churchill. Roosevelt wasn't around. And they this is, I believe, in 42, 43, whenever it wasn't Tehran, I think it was before Tehran. Churchill and Stalin, took out a map, and Churchill said, I want 80% of Greece, and Stalin said, I want 60% of Poland, And they wired Roosevelt about these agreements, right, or what they had discussed. And Roosevelt said, that's not going to happen. That's not what we're going to do. There were no Poles at that meeting. There were no Greeks at that meeting. That's just not going to happen. So he contradicted both Churchill and Stalin. And the biggest thing Roosevelt fought for, and of course Helga will love this when she finds out, Roosevelt was the one, but neither Churchill nor Stalin wanted the Chinese in the Security Council. And Roosevelt said, the United States will not join the Security Council without China being in the Security Council, and we won't join the United Nations because it wouldn't be the United Nations. So and he pretty much said, this is not a white man's club where Russia, the United States, and Britain determine how the world goes. He said, this is not a white man's club. Without China, we could not join and would not join a European organization to get us involved in another war. He also argued with 400 million Chinese in 20 years from now, and this is what he said, in 20 years from now, they will be the dominant nation in all of Asia. And therefore they must be part of the deliberation process for as part of the United Nations. And then, this will shock you, when the assassination of Hitler failed, and Roosevelt knew nothing about it, he said, we don't go around assassinating world leaders. I don't care who they are. We start that. Where does it end? That's actually what he said. So what Stalin knew is this was the least pragmatic leader you could have, which is why he trusted him. When he disagreed, he would say it. When he wanted to, he just made it plain who he was. And I could go through other stories, but the Yalta story is just amazing. The way that Susan Butler starts the Yalta story, and I'm going to read you some quotes because otherwise I want to give you a character of what this unbelievable researcher has come up with. Okay? Hold on. I got it. Whoop. Okay. Hold on. Okay. And I'm going to read you.
Gerry, let me just say, so keep in mind the time so we can get to the actual questions. There are already questions coming in about this, so just know that.
Oh boy! Whoa. Okay. Well, yeah, I'm excited, as you can tell, about the subject. All right. Well, let me just develop it. I'll skip something. Yeah, in The Hinge of Fate, which was written by Churchill, he said, "No great portion of the world's population was so effectively protected from the horrors of World War as were the people of India." Now, this is her, Butler, commenting. "Nothing could be further from the truth. British rule over India was every bit as brutal as Stalin's rule over Russia. In fact, in many cases, worse." And then she details under Churchill and his failure to give India independence, he starved to death 3 million Indians and destroyed several million others. 13% of the population of Bengal died under Churchill's rule of India. This was in 1942, during the war. So Roosevelt would have nothing to do with Churchill on what. I'm skipping around a bit because I'm sorry, I sort of lost control. Well, the three things that were negotiated at Yalta were, one, the disposition of Poland, which you lied about what really happened there, and was later revisited after Roosevelt's death. Of course, the United Nations and a $6 billion loan, a development loan for Russia at 2.5% over 30 years to buy American goods at the end of the war, and the credit would be issued not by Lend-Lease, but an actual loan to Russia, which is part of the Bretton Woods arrangements. Now, finally, the punchline on the Cold War. Roosevelt died, and within hours, Truman didn't, when Lynn said Truman was a little man, he meant it. Truman was never went into the map room. He knew nothing about world politics. So Roosevelt's team had briefed him extensively on Yalta and what the agreements were, and that there would be a Molotov would be coming there after the meeting in San Francisco to found the United Nations. So when Molotov got to Truman and met with Truman at the White House, which was part of the agreement, Truman said to Molotov, "Tell your president I want full and free elections in Poland." He stood up and walked out. Molotov was mortified. He did everything that Stettinius and everybody had briefed him on in terms of what Roosevelt had accomplished, what the relation was, what the potentials were, and he blew the thing up and announced the Iron Curtain speech. Now, here's the real punchline, besides him being completely labile fool. And this she documents completely. Every single scientist at the Manhattan Project, and including Niels Bohr, had advised both Roosevelt, who was going to share all the atomic bomb secrets with Stalin. He was going to request the Soviets work with us to develop the atom bomb and the peaceful use of nuclear energy afterwards. And every single scientist argued you couldn't keep this a secret, and that if you just kept it a secret, then what you would have is an arms race. And for the 2 to 3 years that the Russians did not have, or the Soviets did not have the atom bomb, you would have the most dangerous situation imaginable. At Potsdam, which is when it was Truman, Churchill, and Stalin. At Potsdam, Truman was supposed to propose, according to the scientists, that we would share and work with the Russian Soviets to develop this capability. What Truman did at Potsdam was he announced that we have a working bomb. We've dropped it on Hiroshima. We're about to drop it on another island, Nagasaki, and proposed nothing to Stalin and walked away. At that moment, the Cold War started. Everything that Roosevelt had attempted to do to create a community of nations at the United Nations was literally blown up. Not just by Truman, but Harriman, the Wall Street Harriman. The second Roosevelt died, he advised Truman to take the tough line. He was working with the Dulles brothers, right? And that, in fact, Stettinius, who after Roosevelt died, his last day in office, he was Secretary of War, proposed a cabinet meeting in which he presented sharing the nuclear bomb and the nuclear capability, a joint development with Russia. The cabinet meeting voted 10 or 11 to 14, I forget. But it was Stettinius, who was a Republican who never worked for Roosevelt, who proposed it to Truman. And Truman had this cabinet meeting. Harriman was against it, Forrestal was against it, and Vinson was against it. The next day, it was leaked to the New York Times that Henry Wallace, who they had red baited through proposed sharing the secret with the Soviets. This is the New York Times next day. That it was Wallace, and that the cabinet voted against it. Total lie. But it was Harriman who leaked it to the New York Times. Had we, in the spirit of Franklin Roosevelt, accepted the sovereignty of all the nations and the sharing of technology with all the nations and the development of all the nations, as was the implicit, which was explicit in the Bretton Woods. Had we, Truman, Churchill, who hated Roosevelt, who hated his idea of the community principle, who hated the United Nations, hated it. And at one point, Churchill went crazy about the idea of trusteeships. I'm truncating the story. To have development for the whole world and sovereign government. And once the Cold War started, Bretton Woods, all the developments that Roosevelt and his team had given the world as the post-war, that would have become the post-war period, was quite literally destroyed. It was not Stalin who started the Cold War. It was Churchill, Truman, Harriman, Dulles, who worked literally with the Nazis. They started the Cold War. And what ensued is their fault. And so that's what I'd like to open it up with.